May 8th. 1945 arrived not with triumph but with stunned silence in the makeshift detention center outside Heidelberg, where Greta Hoffmann pressed her face against the wire fence and watched her world dissolve. The Third Reich had collapsed exactly 3 days earlier, and now she and 200 other German women nurses, communications officers, and auxiliary personnel sat in limbo, prisoners of an army they had been taught to fear and despise. The spring sun warmed her shoulders, but Greta felt only cold disbelief as she observed the American soldiers moving about the compound with an ease that defied everything she thought she knew about racial hierarchy. Greta had served as a communications specialist in the Wehrmacht, her fingers once dancing across telegraph keys that transmitted orders across a crumbling empire. Now those same fingers gripped the fence wire as she witnessed something her 12 years of Nazi indoctrination had declared impossible. American soldiers, both white and black, were eating together at the same table just 50 meters from where she stood. Not segregated, not hierarchical. Together. Das ist unglitch, whispered Marguerite Schultz beside her. A former Luftwaffe nurse, whose pristine worldview now lay shattered like bombed-out Berlin. They said the Americans kept them separated. They said the whites would never allow such mixing. According to historian Stephen Ambrose's research documented in Citizen Soldiers, the reality of American military racial dynamics was far more complex than Nazi propaganda had portrayed. Though segregation remained official U.S. Army policy throughout World War II, the women watching this scene had been fed a steady diet of propaganda depicting American racial tensions as proof of democratic weakness. Yet here they witnessed something that contradicted years of carefully constructed lies. The compound itself reflected the chaos of Germany's collapse. Hastily erected tents surrounded by barbed wire housed women who weeks earlier had believed in final victory. And now they subsisted on American rations, wore whatever clothes survived the war, and confronted the cognitive dissonance of losing to an enemy they had been taught was racially and morally inferior. The irony was not lost on Greta, though she hardly dared articulate it even in her own thoughts. Staff Sergeant James Mitchell, a black soldier from Chicago's South Side, carried his mess tray toward a table where 3 white soldiers already sat. Greta held her breath, anticipating the confrontation she had been programmed to expect. Instead, one of the white soldiers, a lanky corporal with red hair, nodded and said something that made Mitchell laugh. They began eating, talking, occasionally gesturing as they shared some joke Greta could not hear. 12 years, Greta murmured, more to herself than Marguerite. 12 years they told us about racial science, about natural hierarchy, about the dangers of mixing races. She paused, watching Mitchell pass a packet of cigarettes to the red-haired corporal. Look at them, they're just ... men. This simple observation contained within it the seed of everything the Reich had tried to prevent, the recognition of common humanity across racial lines. For women like Greta and Marguerite, raised in a totalitarian system that made racial hierarchy central to its identity, this moment represented more than military defeat. It represented the collapse of an entire epistemological framework, the crumbling of every certainty they had been taught to hold sacred. May 9th, 1945 dawned gray and uncertain, much like the mental state of the German women prisoners who gathered in small clusters throughout the detention compound. Whispering about what they had witnessed the previous day, Greta Hoffmann had barely slept, her mind replaying the scene of integrated American soldiers with the obsessive quality of a broken phonograph. Each replay brought new questions that challenged the foundation of her education under the National Socialist regime. Hildegard Braun, a former secretary at Wehrmacht headquarters in Berlin, joined Greta and Marguerite near the eastern fence, where they could observe the American mess area. Hildegard was 32, nearly a decade older than Greta, and worked in positions where she encountered the highest levels of Nazi bureaucracy. Her presence commanded respect among the detained women, though that respect now existed in a strange vacuum where former hierarchies meant nothing. I assisted at a conference in 1942, Hildegard said quietly, her eyes tracking the movement of American soldiers across the compound. Propaganda ministry officials presented extensive documentation about American racial problems. They showed us photographs of segregated facilities, separate water fountains, lynch mobs. She paused, her voice dropping to barely a whisper. They told us America was tearing itself apart over the race question. What Hildegard described was accurate. The United States Army remained officially segregated throughout the war, a fact documented extensively in Ulysses Lee's The Employment of Negro Troops, published by the U.S. Army's Office of Military History. Black soldiers served in separate units, often relegated to support roles, and faced discrimination both in uniform and at home. Yet the propaganda the women had received had exaggerated and distorted these realities to serve Nazi ideological purposes. "Then why are they eating together?" Marguerite asked, gesturing toward the mess area, where once again black and white soldiers shared tables without apparent conflict. The propaganda showed complete separation. Greta understood Marguerite's confusion because she felt it herself. A dizzying sensation of reality refusing to match expectation. The Nazi education system had drilled into German youth a rigid hierarchy of races with elaborate pseudoscientific justifications for maintaining racial purity. The Americans, they were taught, recognized these truths but lacked the will to enforce them properly, leading to social chaos and violence. Yet here, in this small detention camp in occupied Germany, the evidence contradicted the theory. A young lieutenant named Robert Thornton approached the fence, his uniform crisp, despite the chaos of occupation. He was white, perhaps 25, with kind eyes that crinkled when he smiled. Behind him walked Corporal David Washington, a black soldier whose easy stride suggested confidence rather than subservience. "Good morning, ladies," Lieutenant Thornton said in heavily accented German. "We need to process your paperwork today. Please form orderly lines at the administration tent." Greta watched, fascinated, as Washington handed Thornton a clipboard without ceremony, their hands briefly touching in the exchange. No flinching, no discomfort. Just two soldiers working together with the casual familiarity of colleagues. This small gesture spoke volumes to women trained to see such contact as unthinkable. As the women moved toward the administration tent, Greta overheard Corporal Washington speaking to Lieutenant Thornton in English. Though her English was limited, she caught enough to understand they were discussing leave time and whether the mess hall would serve chicken or beef that evening. The mundane nature of their conversation struck her with unexpected force. These were not the carefully staged interactions of propaganda films, but the authentic, unremarkable exchange of men who worked together daily. May 12, 1945 brought unseasonably warm weather to the Heidelberg region, and with it, increased interaction between the detained German women and their American captors. Greta Hoffmann sat in the processing line, her temporary identification papers clutched in sweating palms. Watching as Corporal David Washington methodically worked through the bureaucratic requirements of occupation, his patience surprised her. Everything about these Americans surprised her. Behind Washington, a white sergeant named Michael O'Brien organized files with practiced efficiency. The two men worked in synchronized rhythm, occasionally consulting each other about paperwork discrepancies or translation issues. Their collaboration appeared so natural that Greta found herself questioning whether her education had been not merely incomplete, but deliberately falsified. Hoffmann Greta, Washington read from her papers, his pronunciation of the German name, careful but imperfect. Communications specialist? Yes, Greta corrected herself, remembering the English word. Her hands trembled slightly as she handed over additional documentation. At 23, she had spent nearly half her life under National Socialist rule. Attending Bund Deutscher Machtel meetings as a girl, before her technical aptitude led her into military communications. The regime had been her entire adult education. Sergeant O'Brien leaned over to examine her papers, his shoulder nearly touching Washington's. "She worked at the Frankfurt Communications Hub," he said. "That's significant. We'll need additional clearance." The casual physical proximity between the two men struck Greta with the force of revelation. Nazi racial theory, which she had studied extensively in school and through mandatory political education sessions, had taught that racial mixing led to inevitable conflict and degradation. Yet here were men of different races working in close quarters without the tension or violence she had been conditioned to expect. Marguerite Schultz, processing ahead of Greta, turned back with wide eyes. "They're speaking to each other like equals," she whispered in German. "Like actual equals." An older woman named Keith Richter, a former military nurse from Bavaria, overheard and made a sharp, dismissive sound. "It is for show," she insisted, though her voice lacked conviction. "The Americans want us to think they are united. This is propaganda, just like we created propaganda." But Greta was no longer certain. Propaganda required audience and purpose. These Americans were not performing for the German women prisoners. They were simply existing together, working together, eating together. The accumulation of small, unremarkable interactions was dismantling her worldview more effectively than any lecture or pamphlet could have managed. According to research preserved in the National Archives and documented in Mary Pennock, Motley's The Invisible Soldier, The Reality of Race Relations in the American Military During World War II existed in a complex gray area between official segregation policy and practical necessity. While Jim Crow laws remained in effect and the military maintained separate black and white units, the demands of war sometimes created situations where integration occurred out of necessity rather than ideology. Miss Hoffman Washington said, pulling her attention back to the present, "You speak English well? We may need interpreters. Are you willing to work with us?" The question hung in the air, loaded with implications Greta was only beginning to understand. To work with her former enemies, to collaborate with men her education had taught her to consider racially inferior, to accept that everything she had been told about natural hierarchy and racial science might be fundamentally wrong. Yes, she heard herself say. I will help. Behind her, Keith Richter muttered something about collaboration and shame, but Greta barely heard. She was too busy processing the slight smile that crossed Washington's face, the approving nod from Sergeant O'Brien, and the strange sensation of being treated with basic human dignity by men she had been taught to fear and despise. May 15th. 1945 marked Greta Hoffman's first full day working as an interpreter for the American occupation forces, and with it came an intimacy with her captors that accelerated the unraveling of her ideological foundations. She stood in the compound's makeshift office, translating between Captain William Harrison and a group of detained German officers, when she observed the daily rhythm of American military life in ways her previous distance had not permitted. During a break in questioning, she watched as Sergeant O'Brien and Corporal Washington shared a thermos of coffee, passing it back and forth without separate cups or any acknowledgement that this simple act violated every principle of racial separation she had been taught. The thermos itself, battered metal with a dented lid, became in that moment a symbol of everything the Reich had declared impossible. Greta, Captain Harrison said, using her first name with the casual American informality that still startled her. I need you to explain to these officers that we require complete documentation of their unit's movements from January to April of this year. She nodded and translated, but her attention remained divided. Across the room, Private First Class Robert Jackson, another black soldier, entered carrying a stack of files. Lieutenant Thornton looked up from his desk and waved him over. Jackson, perfect timing. I need those requisition forms you were working on. Got them right here, sir, Jackson replied. And the exchange continued with the mundane efficiency of bureaucracy anywhere. The title Sir, from a black soldier to a white officer, echoed strangely in Greta's ears respect. Based on rank rather than race, another contradiction of her education. That afternoon, Hildegard Brown approached Greta during the lunch distribution. Hildegard's face showed the strain of cognitive dissonance, her once certain expression now clouded with doubt. I have been watching them for days now, she said quietly, accepting her portion of tinned meat and bread. The black soldiers, they carry weapons just like the white soldiers. They give orders. The white soldiers obey those orders. I have seen this also, Greta confirmed. In Berlin, at the propaganda ministry, they showed us films, Hildegard continued, her voice barely above a whisper. They showed American newsreels of race riots, segregation, violence. They told us the Americans kept the black soldiers as essentially slave labor, never armed, never trusted. She paused, watching as Sergeant Washington directed a detail of soldiers, both black and white, in reorganizing the supply tent. Lied to us, Greta, about everything. The realization hung between them, heavy with implications, neither woman was quite ready to fully articulate. If the regime had lied about American racial dynamics, what else had been fabricated? The lies about Jewish people, about the necessity of war, about Germany's inevitable triumph. Keith Richter joined them, her disapproval evident in every line of her stern face. At 47, Keith represented the older generation, those who had experienced the Weimar Republic's chaos and welcomed the Nazi promise of order and national revival. You collaborate to Italy, she said to Greta. Have you forgotten everything you learned? These people are our enemies. The war is over, Greta replied quietly.
How we lost.
The war of armies, perhaps? Keith countered. But not the war of ideas. Our science was correct, even if our military was defeated. Look at them, they maintain separation in their own country. We were not wrong about racial differences. We were simply more honest about implementing the truth. But even as Keith spoke, the evidence contradicted her. Through the office window, Greta could see the mess hall where lunch service was underway. Black and white soldiers filled their trays at the same serving line, sat at the same tables, engaged in the same conversations and jokes that soldiers everywhere shared. The separation Keith insisted defined American society seemed notably absent in this particular corner of occupied Germany. According to documentation preserved in the historical record, including accounts compiled by the U.S. Army Heritage and Education Center, the reality was indeed more nuanced than either Nazi propaganda or American idealism suggested. The U.S. military remained officially segregated. Yet the practical demands of occupation and the gradual evolution of racial attitudes among some combat veterans created spaces where integration occurred informally, particularly in overseas theaters far from Jim Crow's direct influence. That evening, as Greta returned to her sleeping quarters, she overheard a conversation between two young American soldiers, one black and one white, discussing their plans to visit Paris on leave together. May 20th, 1945 brought an unexpected education session to the detention compound. Though not of the type Greta Hoffman had experienced during her years in the Reich school system, Captain Harrison had organized what he called a denazification briefing, gathering groups of German prisoners to discuss the realities of the regime they had served. Greta attended as interpreter, a role that forced her to engage with uncomfortable truths in two languages simultaneously. The briefing took place in the largest tent, where approximately 40 German women sat on folding chairs arranged in rows. Captain Harrison stood at the front alongside Lieutenant Thornton and Staff Sergeant Mitchell, the three men presenting a visual argument that required no translation. White officer, a white junior officer, and a black non-commissioned officer, standing together as equals in authority, if not in rank. "Ladies," Harrison began, waiting for Greta to translate, "we are going to discuss the racial theories you were taught and explain why they were scientifically and morally false." A murmur rippled through the assembled women. Some, like Marguerite and Hildegard, leaned forward with evident interest. Others, including Keith Richter and her small circle of older women, crossed their arms in defensive posture. Greta translated carefully, aware that every word carried weight beyond its literal meaning. Staff Sergeant Mitchell stepped forward, his bearing confident despite facing an audience educated to consider him inferior. "I know what you were taught about people who look like me," he said. And Greta translated his words into German, feeling the sting of truth in each syllable. "I know the propaganda films you saw, the textbooks you studied, the lies you were told." He paused, letting Greta's translation catch up. "My name is James Alexander Mitchell. I was born in Chicago, Illinois in 1917. I graduated from high school in 1935, top of my class in mathematics. I worked as a postal clerk before the war. I have a wife named Dorothy and a daughter named Sarah who I have not seen in 18 months. He let these facts settle over the room. I am not inferior. I am not subhuman. I am a man, a soldier, and an American citizen." The silence that followed was profound. Greta felt tears prick her eyes as she translated Mitchell's words, hearing in them the echo of all the propaganda she had absorbed, all the casual cruelty her education had normalized. To hear Mitchell assert his humanity so plainly, listing the ordinary facts of an ordinary life, somehow struck deeper than any political argument could have managed. Keith Richter raised her hand. "But you maintain segregation in America," she said through Greta's translation. "Your own country keeps you separated. How can you claim equality when your own people deny it?" Mitchell's expression tightened, and Greta recognized pain beneath his professional composure. "You are correct," he said, and his honesty surprised everyone, including Captain Harrison, who shifted uncomfortably. "America is not perfect. We have Jim Crow laws in the South. We have discrimination in the North. Black Americans fight for freedoms abroad that we do not fully enjoy at home." He stepped closer to the seated women. "But here's the difference between America and the Reich you served. In America, we argue about these injustices. We debate them. We organize and protest and fight for change through democratic means. Some of us believe we will achieve true equality, perhaps not in my lifetime, but eventually. Your regime did not debate racial theory, it made it law, science, and religion. It murdered millions based on racial ideology. Do you understand the difference? According to historical analysis documented in works like John Hope Franklin's From Slavery to Freedom, Mitchell's description captured the complex reality of mid-20th century American race relations, a system of discrimination that was nonetheless fundamentally different from the Nazi program of racial extermination. Though this difference provided little comfort to those experiencing American racism, Marguerite raised her hand tentatively. How do you? How do you serve a country that treats you as less than equal? Mitchell considered the question carefully before answering. Because I believe in what America could be, not just what it is. Because fighting the Nazis was right, regardless of how imperfect my own country might be. Some of my white fellow soldiers, he gestured to Lieutenant Thornton, have shown me that change is possible. Lieutenant. Thornton nodded, stepping forward. I grew up in Mississippi, he said, and Greta translated. I was raised in a segregated society. I attended segregated schools. I drank from whites-only water fountains. May 23, 1945 arrived with heavy rain that turned the detention compound into a maze of mud and standing water. But the weather matched the turbulent atmosphere among the German women prisoners as they processed the previous briefing's revelations. Greta Hoffman sat in the interpreter's office, ostensibly reviewing documents, but actually wrestling with memories of her education that now appeared in a harsh new light. A knock on the doorframe interrupted her thoughts. Hildegard Brown stood in the doorway, her clothing damp from the rain, her face showing the exhaustion of someone who had not slept properly in days. May I speak with you? She asked. Privately, Greta glanced around the small office. Sergeant O'Brien and Corporal Washington were out on inspection, leaving her alone with her thoughts, and, now with Hildegard, of course. Sit. Hildegard pulled a chair close, her voice dropping to a near whisper despite their privacy. I need to tell someone, and I think you might understand. She paused, gathering courage. In 1943, I worked at Wehrmacht headquarters in Berlin. My office was near the sections that coordinated with the SSI. I saw reports. Greta felt her stomach tighten. She had spent the past weeks confronting her beliefs about racial hierarchy in American society, but she had carefully avoided thinking too deeply about what those false beliefs had justified, what they had enabled. Reports about the camps? Greta asked quietly, using the oblique language they had all employed during the war. It's never speaking directly about what everyone somehow knew and did not know simultaneously. Hildegard nodded, tears beginning to stream down her face. I saw requisition forms. Zyklin be thousands of kilograms. I asked my supervisor what it was for, and he told me it was for delousing, for typhus prevention. She wiped her eyes roughly. But the quantities, Greta, the quantities were impossible for mere delousing, and the destinations Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor. I knew these were labor camps, but double quotes, you suspected, Greta said, not quite a question. I suspected. I knew something terrible was happening, but I told myself it was necessary for the war effort. That the Jews were enemies of the Reich, that our leaders knew best. Hildegard's voice broke. I believed what they taught us, about racial hierarchy, about the Jewish question. I believed, and because I believed, I did nothing. The confession hung in the small office like a physical presence. Greta wanted to offer comfort, but she recognized in Hildegard's story a version of her own complicity. She too had believed. She too had served the Reich's purposes, translating messages, maintaining communications that helped coordinate a war machine built on genocidal ideology. When I watch Sergeant Mitchell, Hildegard continued, when I see him working alongside white soldiers, being respected for his abilities, I realize how thoroughly we were lied to. If they lied about American racial dynamics, about the basic humanity of black people, then she could not finish the sentence, but Greta understood. If the racial science was false, then the entire justification for the camps, for the murders, for the war itself, collapsed into mere atrocity without even the thin veneer of ideological consistency. The door opened and Corporal Washington entered, shaking rain from his coat. He stopped short, seeing the two women in intense conversation, Hildegard clearly crying. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, he said. No, it is fine, Greta assured him in English, then translated for Hildegard, who was frantically wiping her eyes. Washington hesitated, then spoke gently. "Ma'am, I don't know what you're going through, but I've seen that look before. We had some German men prisoners last month who broke down when they realized what they'd been part of." He pulled up a chair, his movement slow and non-threatening. "It's not easy, facing the truth about what you believed and what you did, but it's necessary." Hildegard looked up at him, this black American soldier whose very existence contradicted her education, whose kindness in this moment exposed the cruelty of her former beliefs. "I do not deserve your understanding," she said through Greta's translation. "Maybe not," Washington replied honestly. May 28th. 1945 marked a shift in the detention compound's atmosphere as news from the wider world penetrated the wire. Fences and forced confrontations with truths the German women had spent years denying. Captain Harrison gathered another assembly, this time with a different purpose. A film projector had been set up in the main tent, and rumors circulated among the prisoners about what they would be forced to witness. Greta Hoffman approached the tent with dread coiling in her stomach. She had heard whispers from other camps, stories of Americans forcing German civilians and prisoners to watch films from the liberated concentration camps. Now that experience had arrived at their compound. Inside the tent, approximately 60 German women sat in tense silence. Keith Richter and her contingent occupied the back rows, their faces set in expressions of stubborn resistance. Marguerite and Hildegard sat with Greta in the middle section, holding hands like frightened children about to receive punishment they knew they deserved. Captain Harrison stood before the projector, his usual friendly demeanor replaced by something harder and more judgmental. Beside him, Staff Sergeant Mitchell and Lieutenant Thornton stood with similarly grave expressions. "What you are about to see," Harrison said through Greta's interpretation, is footage taken by American and British forces as they liberated the concentration camps at Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, and Buchenwald. These are not propaganda films. These are documentary records of what your government did in your name. The lights dimmed. The projector clattered to life. And for the next 45 minutes, Greta Hoffman and her fellow prisoners confronted the material reality of the ideology they had served. The images required no translation. Skeletal bodies stacked like cordwood, mass graves filled with thousands of corpses, survivors who looked more like animated skeletons than living humans, gas chambers disguised as showers, crematoria, mountains of confiscated belongings, shoes, eyeglasses, suitcases, marked with names of people who would never reclaim them. According to documentation held at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, the footage shown to German prisoners and civilians in the spring and summer of 1945 came from official military film units who documented the camp's liberation, creating permanent records of Nazi atrocities that could not be denied or dismissed as enemy propaganda. Greta felt vomit rise in her throat. Out beside her, Marguerite was weeping openly. Hildegard had her hand over her mouth, her body shaking with silent sobs. Throughout the tent, women were crying, some trying to look away, only to be ordered by American guards to watch. Even Keith Richter's resistant facade cracked, tears streaming down her face, though her expression remained defiant. The film showed American soldiers, both black and white, helping survivors. Greta watched through her tears as Sergeant Mitchell's voice came from beside the projector, providing contemporary narration. "Those are men from the 614th Tank Destroyer Battalion," he said. "An all-black unit, so they were among the first to reach some of these camps. They fed the survivors, they carried the sick, they buried the dead." The film showed exactly what Mitchell described, black American soldiers gently helping emaciated prisoners, offering water and food, their faces showing horror and compassion in equal measure. The irony was not subtle. Men, whom Nazi ideology declared inferior, were liberating the victims of that same ideology's logical conclusion. When the lights finally came back on, the silence in the tent was absolute except for crying. Greta could not move. The images had burned themselves into her mind with permanent cruelty, at the cruelty of the Americans for showing them, but the cruelty of the Reich for creating the reality the films documented. Captain Harrison's voice cut through the silence. "You were taught racial science. You were taught about superior and inferior peoples. You were taught that genocide was necessary for racial purity." He paused, letting the weight of those words settle. "What you have just witnessed is where those teachings lead. This is what your ideology created. This is what you supported." Keith Richter stood suddenly, her face red with emotion, anger, shame, or both. "We did not know," she shouted. "Did not know it was like this." Staff Sergeant Mitchell stepped forward, his expression hard. "You knew enough," he said, and Greta translated his words with shaking voice. June 2nd, 1945 brought a profound quiet to the detention compound. As if the screening 5 days earlier had drained all capacity for denial or argument from the German women prisoners, Greta Hoffman found herself spending more time in the American administrative areas, her role as interpreter expanding into something closer to liaison as captain. Harrison began preparing for the eventual release and reintegration of the detained women into occupied German society. On this particular morning, she sat in the small office space, while Sergeant O'Brien and Corporal Washington processed paperwork, their conversation drifting between work matters and personal topics. Greta had become, if not quite invisible to them, at least familiar enough that they no longer modified their behavior in her presence. This casualness itself represented a form of education more powerful than any lecture. "My brother sent a letter," Washington said, holding up an envelope. "He's been discharged already. Medical reasons. Got back to Chicago last month. How's he adjusting?" O'Brien asked, not looking up from his forms. "Not well. Says he can't find work. Goes to apply at places where they're hiring, but suddenly the position is filled when they see his face." Washington's voice carried bitter resignation. "Fought in France, got a Purple Heart, comes home to the same old Jim Crow." O'Brien set down his pen. "It's not right, David. After what you all did, what you all sacrificed." "Right or not, it's reality," Washington interrupted, but not unkindly. "It's what we come back to. You know what's funny? These German women, they watch us eat together and think we've got equality all figured out. They see us working side by side and assume America has solved its race problem. They have no idea what waits for me when I ship home." The conversation struck Greta with particular force because it revealed the limitations of her recent education. She had learned that Nazi racial theory was false, that the propaganda about American society was exaggerated, that black soldiers were capable and brave and fundamentally human. But she had not fully understood that disproving Nazi ideology did not mean America had achieved racial justice. The reality was more complex, more nuanced than the binary of Nazi lies versus American truth. "May I ask a question?" Greta ventured in English. Both men looked up, Washington with slight surprise, O'Brien with encouragement. "Of course," O'Brien said. "If America still has problems with race," Greta struggled with the diplomatic phrasing, "why do you fight for it? Why does Sergeant Mitchell serve? Why do you, Corporal Washington, continue to wear the uniform?" Washington leaned back in his chair, considering his answer carefully. "That's the question, isn't it? My wife asks me the same thing every time I write home." He tapped his fingers on the desk, thinking, "I suppose. I serve because I believe America can be better than it is. Because some men," he nodded at O'Brien, "show me that change is possible, even if it's slow. And because, frankly, despite all our problems, I'd rather live in a country that has the capacity for change than one that makes evil its official policy." "The difference between systemic discrimination and systematic genocide," O'Brien added. "Both are wrong, don't misunderstand me. But one allows for progress, reform, eventual justice. The other, ... double quotes, he trailed off, the recent film screenings images hanging unspoken between them. Marguerite appeared in the doorway, seeking Greta for translation duties elsewhere. But she paused, hearing the conversation. Her English was improving, and she had caught enough to understand the topic. "It is confusing," she said in halting English. "We are taught one thing is truth. We learn it as lie. But then we learn America is not perfect also. How do we know what is true?" Washington smiled sadly. "You don't always know absolute truth, ma'am. What you know is degrees of truth, comparative justice. Is America perfect on race? No. Is it better than Nazi Germany? Absolutely. Can it improve further? That's what we're fighting for, according to documentation from the period, including oral histories collected by the Veterans History Project at the Library of Congress. These kinds of conversations between black American soldiers and German prisoners or civilians occurred frequently during the occupation period. June 10, 1945 brought mail call for the American soldiers, a moment of connection to distant homes and lives interrupted by war. Greta Hoffman observed the ritual from her usual position near the administrative office. noting how the arrival of letters transformed grown soldiers into eager boys, tearing open envelopes with trembling hands. The scene carried a poignant universality. German soldiers had reacted the same way to mail deliveries. She remembered before the postal system collapsed with the Reich itself. Staff Sergeant Mitchell received a thick envelope and stepped away to read in private. But his changing expressions as he absorbed the letter's contents were visible even from a distance. Joy flickered across his face, then concern, then something darker, anger or frustration, Greta could not quite determine. When he finally approached Captain Harrison, his usual professional composure appeared strained. "Sir, I need to discuss my leave request," Mitchell said. And though Greta was not officially part of this conversation, she heard it clearly from her nearby desk. "My wife writes that our daughter is having trouble at school. Other children, their parents, they're saying things about her father being in Europe while their fathers came home, implying I somehow avoided real combat by serving in support units." Harrison's expression hardened. "Your service record speaks for itself, Sergeant. You've seen more combat than most of those men, I'd wager." "Yes, sir, but you know how it is. Black units get less publicity, less recognition." Mitchell's voice carried decades of accumulated frustration. "Dorothy writes that Sarah is being bullied, that the teachers do nothing to stop it. And meanwhile, I'm here, helping rebuild the country that tried to exterminate entire populations, while my daughter suffers back home because I'm not white enough to get proper credit for my service." The bitter irony of Mitchell's situation was not lost on Greta. Here was a man who had risked his life to defeat a regime built on racial hatred, only to return to a country that still discriminated against him and his family. The cognitive dissonance was almost unbearable. Liberation and oppression, justice and injustice, coexisting in the same nation, the same moment. Hildegard joined Greta near the office, listening to Mitchell's conversation. "I want to apologize to him," she said quietly to Greta in German, "for what I believed, what I thought about men like him. But what words could possibly be adequate?" Before Greta could respond, Corporal Washington entered carrying his own letter, his expression troubled. "Jimmy," he said to Mitchell, using the familiar name that indicated their friendship, "you need to read this." He handed over a newspaper clipping that had been enclosed with his mail. Mitchell scanned the article, his jaw tightening. "Race riot in Philadelphia, triggered by the promotion of black transit workers. 3 days of violence," Washington confirmed. "My cousin was there. Says the white workers just couldn't accept black men in positions of authority." Keith Richter had entered the office area for processing and overheard the exchange. "You see?" she said to Greta in German, her voice carrying the defensive tone of someone whose worldview had been shaken, but not destroyed. "They have the same problems we did. Perhaps we were not so wrong about the dangers of racial mixing." Greta felt anger flare hot in her chest, surprising her with its intensity. "We murdered 11 million people," she said to Keith, her voice shaking. 11 million. Jews, Roma, Poles, Soviet prisoners, disabled people, political opponents. We built factories of death. Do not dare to compare our crimes to civil unrest in Philadelphia." The office fell silent. Even Mitchell and Washington paused their conversation to look at the German women. Keith's face reddened, but she said nothing more, retreating from the office with whatever dignity she could maintain. Greta turned to Mitchell, gathering her courage. "Sergeant, may I speak with you?" "Privately." Mitchell exchanged a glance with Washington, then nodded. They stepped outside into the June sunshine, walking a short distance from the office before Greta found her voice. "I want to apologize," she said in careful English, "for what I was taught, for what I believed about people like you, for serving a regime that murdered millions based on lies about racial science." The words felt inadequate, but she pressed on. "Watching you work, seeing your dedication despite how your own country sometimes treats you, listening to your patience with us with me, I understand now that everything I was taught was not just wrong but evil." Mitchell listened without interruption, his expression unreadable. June 21, 1945, marked the beginning of releases from the detention compound, as American authorities determined that many of the German women prisoners posed no significant security risk and could be returned to civilian life in occupied Germany. Greta Hoffman received notification that she would be released within the week, along with Marguerite and several dozen other women deemed suitable for reintegration. The news should have brought relief, but instead, she felt untethered. uncertain about returning to a country that no longer existed in the form she had known. On her final day working as an interpreter, Captain Harrison called Greta into his office for a concluding interview. Staff Sergeant Mitchell and Lieutenant Thornton were present, along with a stenographer to record the conversation for official files. The small office felt crowded with bodies and the weight of everything that had transpired over the past 6 weeks. Miss Hoffman, Harrison began formally. You've been helpful during your detention. Your language skills and willingness to work with us reflect well on your character. Before we release you, I want to ensure you understand what you're returning to. Greta nodded, waiting. Germany is destroyed, Harrison continued bluntly. The cities are rubble. The economy is shattered. Millions are displaced. The occupation will continue for years, perhaps decades. You will live under military government, subject to strict regulations and denazification procedures. It will not be easy. I understand, sir, Greta replied quietly. Nothing should be easy. Not after what we did. Mitchell leaned forward. Miss Hoffman, I want to ask you something personal. When you return to civilian life, when you interact with other Germans who still believe the old ideology, what will you tell them? What will you say about what you learned here? The question hung in the air, profound in its simplicity. Greta took a moment to formulate her response. I will tell them the truth, she said finally, that we were lied to, that racial science was false, that the camps were real and even worse than rumored, that the Americans who defeated us were not the weak, racially chaotic society our propaganda portrayed, but rather men of all backgrounds working together, however imperfectly. She paused, gathering courage for what came next. I will tell them that I watched black and white American soldiers eat together, work together, fight together, that I saw black soldiers liberate concentration camp victims, that I learned humanity transcends race. Her voice strengthened. And I will tell them that Germany must never again build its identity on hatred and lies about human worth. Marguerite, waiting outside the office, would tell similar truths when her turn came. Hildegard, released 2 days earlier, had already returned to her family in Bavaria, carrying the burden of knowledge she could neither forget nor fully articulate. Even Keith Richter, released with restrictions due to her higher-level party membership, left the compound changed, though she would struggle for years to reconcile her shattered beliefs with her continued conviction that the old order had possessed some core truth. According to historical research, including that documented in Frederick Taylor's Exercising Hitler, the occupation and denazification of Germany, the process of ideological transformation in post-war Germany was neither simple nor universal. Some Germans confronted their complicity directly. Others spent decades in denial or partial acknowledgement. The women of the Heidelberg detention compound represented the full spectrum of this painful reckoning. Staff Sergeant Mitchell stood to shake Greta's hand, a gesture that would have been unthinkable under the regime she had served. Miss Hoffman, I hope you carry the truth forward. Germany needs people willing to face hard realities. Thank you, Sergeant, Greta replied, accepting his handshake. May I ask, what will you do when you return home, to the America that still discriminates against you? Mitchell smiled, though it carried more sadness than joy. Keep fighting. Different battlefield, same war against ignorance and hatred. Maybe it will take 20 years, maybe 50, but I believe America will eventually live up to its ideals. Someone has to keep pushing toward that day. I hope I live to see that day, Greta said sincerely. I hope Germany finds its own path to redemption, though we deserve none. On June 24, 1945, Greta Hoffman walked through the compound gates, carrying a small bag of possessions and a mind forever changed by what she had witnessed. Behind her, the American flag flew over the detention center where the simple act of men eating together had shattered a worldview. Before her lay a ruined Germany that would spend generations confronting the consequences of believing that some lives mattered less than others. Marguerite walked beside her, and together they moved toward an uncertain future in occupied territory. It is strange, Marguerite said as they walked down the muddy road toward Heidelberg proper. 6 weeks ago, I knew everything with certainty. Now I am certain of nothing except that everything I knew was wrong. That is perhaps the beginning of wisdom, Greta replied. To know that we were deceived, that we allowed ourselves to be deceived because the lies confirmed what we wanted to believe about ourselves. They walked on in silence, Two women among millions who would spend the rest of their lives processing what they had been part of, what they had enabled, and what they had finally learned when the simple humanity of men eating together revealed the monstrous inhumanity of the ideology they had served. Behind them, the compound continued its work of processing prisoners and beginning the long, painful process of transforming a nation. Inside, Corporal David Washington and Sergeant Michael O'Brien shared lunch at the same table. An unremarkable act that had become, for some who witnessed it, a revolution of consciousness more powerful than any army. The story of what happened in that small detention camp near Heidelberg in the spring and summer of 1945 would be repeated in variations across occupied Germany, moments where the contrast between Nazi ideology and reality became too stark to ignore, where the humanity of the supposed enemy exposed the inhumanity of one's own beliefs. For Greta Hoffman and women like her, these moments did not erase guilt or provide redemption. But they offered something perhaps more valuable: the possibility of understanding, the first painful step toward a different future built on different truths.